Hello and welcome to the Space in Between podcast. I'm your host, Leigh Morgan. This podcast is for listeners who are fed up with the hyper-polarized nature of the world today and who crave spaces where current events can be discussed in constructive, enlightening, and delightful ways. Let's get started. We are living through a time of deep uncertainty, politically, socially, and for some of us, even at work. Many people are asking, how can we stay grounded, lead with integrity, and remain connected when trust can often feel fragile? At the same time, many of us who are committed to creating a more heart-centered world, well, we are finding each other. And that is what this podcast is all about. Today's conversation begins with a simple but powerful idea. There's no such thing as a neutral space. The environments we move through every day are constantly influencing how we feel, how we show up, and how open we are to ourselves and to one another. Given this reality, it makes sense to understand how the environments and spaces we spend time in impact us. It turns out that there is an entire field dedicated to this. And I was tickled last year to learn about it. It's called biophilia. And today we will explore how biophilia principles can support dignity, connection, and resilience in our daily lives. My guest today, Elizabeth MacPherson-Hearn, is the perfect person to explore this terrain with us. Elizabeth is an award-winning designer at Mithun, a leading global architecture firm, and her work draws on biophilia, psychology, and community connection. She thinks deeply about how spaces can teach, how they can restore a sense of agency, and how even small choices can help all of us feel more grounded in chaotic times. So this is going to be a great show today. Elizabeth, I'm so honored to have you on the show. Welcome to the Space in Between.
Thank you so much, Leah. I'm so excited to talk with you about this. I'm super passionate about it, as you know, as we've talked before.
Before we dive into our topic, I'd like to know, where does your passion come from?
That's such a fun question. It's funny because my kids will often say, "Oh my goodness, Mom, are we going to talk about biophilia again at dinner tonight?" And I'm like, "Oh my gosh, you guys, it's so important." But, way back when my dad was in the medical field, and it was something that I thought that maybe that's where I would head. In combination, I was in a variety of athletic adventures, and my high school biology teacher, was also my basketball coach. And I just fell in love with biology. I just thought it was so amazing, and physiology. And so I went to college thinking I was going to be a PT, go into PT. And then I took a class in the architecture department at University of Oregon. And then starstruck, I just thought, this is it. This is it. So I was able to get into the program there. And then as I've moved through my career as an interior architect, I've really been drawn to this idea of using this science background that I sort of started my early years with, and combining it with architecture and design and health and well-being. And I've been studying it and researching it for probably 25, 30 years, health and wellness, mass timber, biophilia. And a funny kind of fun little excerpt here is my dad and I right now, who's 92, are taking a neuroscience and architecture class with Stanford, just to further our knowledge and excitement over this topic. So super fun.
So it runs in the family. I
It
love
kind
that.
of does, I guess. Yeah.
I love that. And was there a moment for you in your childhood, or maybe it was just when you took that first class at the University of Oregon, where you realized how your environments actually have impacted you and how you feel and act and engage with the world?
I was fortunate to do a fair amount of travel when I was young with my grandparents. And remember being in spaces, especially overseas, that had all these natural materials, all this daylight, and just being so drawn to that. And now coming sort of full circle, one of the things, and actually one of the things about my class at U of O that was so engaging to me, it was so sensory. The smells in the building were all about architecture, the smells of the wood, the music, everything about that space and place to me was really engaging. So between my travels and really being drawn to spaces that have some of these elements that I didn't know what they were, but now I understand what some of those elements are and how those make us really being drawn to spaces that have these thoughts that we'll get into. But yeah,
Yeah, neat. You introduced the concept of smell, which is very evocative. For me, I use actually I have a lot often have candles lit, etc. There's some smells that I just, sweet candles, floral stuff, ick. But I think that's just one of these broad sensory experiences. And for you, that was one of them that just stood out. I think that's
absolutely.
true for so many of us. So, well, let's dive into this concept of biophilia. And can you share how do you define biophilia? What do you want all of us to know about that concept?
That's great. Biophilia is our innate need to be connected to nature. And it really is at our core, and it's really at a cellular level. We've kind of created what we call 14 elements of biophilia. Some people say there's 15 now. But the long and the short of it is there are three sort of buckets of biophilia. And I'll give you some examples. Under the first bucket is this idea of direct interaction with the world. So, whether it's visual connection to the outside, whether it's the presence of water, those are elements of biophilia under that bucket of direct interaction with nature. The second bucket is what we call indirect interaction, which is more about biophilic forms, patterns, materials that are actually in nature that we sometimes will bring into our worlds inside. And then the third bucket is what we call spatial configuration. And that is things like prospect and refuge and risk and peril.
So there's three ways. So directly like being in nature and being in a walk. And then it might be in my home. I'm thinking about some new artwork and I want something that's made of wood. That's that
Yeah.
middle one, which is kind of
Yeah.
indirect. So I can kind of bring that in, or maybe even a pattern in a non-natural thing that reminds me or etc. Say a little more about just that last thing. We're going to dive into a lot of these as well, but I don't understand the last one very
The
well.
last one. Yeah, no, absolutely. This is one of my favorite because it's not as obvious. It's called spatial configuration, and what it is, an example of one of those elements is prospect and refuge. If you think about a space that you've been in, I'll just use a restaurant for example. If there are areas of booth seating on
Yeah.
the edges, 95% of the time those are filled first and then you move to the inside. And part of that is for innate sense of having the sense of being, you're in a refuge.
Well, I seek out booze all the time, but it's some innate sense. It's not just that I like booze. More
Yeah,
predictable seating.
the sense of
Yeah.
protection and yeah,
Oh, that's really helpful. So that can be a way of calming ourselves, or if we feel calm already, it just can feel better. Again, that sense of safety, which is such a important element to feeling high agency in a world where there's a lot of distrust, right?
absolutely.
So,
Yes.
and you and I just have had again a number of conversations why it was so clear to me I wanted to have you on the show because our sense of agency in a time of a lot of chaos and unsettledness, boy, we got to really ground in that. So here we are learning about biophilia. And I thought of about our conversation a few days ago because I'm a big documentary nerd. Like I've probably watched every PBS documentary. And there's something on about the Incas and about how they designed some of their spaces, not just Machu Picchu, but many other urban spaces. And they would turn and make sure that some of their temples were facing the sun at sunrise and
Mhm.
sunset, so that you had certain light, etc. And it struck me that's a type of biophilia. And so this is an ancient instinct that we have, right? And so,
Absolutely.
so when we do think about this ancient instinct or the refuge of going to that booth, and then here we are in this crazy time, a lot of polarization, there's massive shifts. What in what ways are principles of biophilia that you've shared maybe more relevant than ever? Or would you agree with that?
Oh my gosh, absolutely. Absolutely. I think one of the things that if you think about, why does this matter? I think even after the pandemic, we still have a quarter or a third of our population have serious symptoms of depression and anxiety. That's huge. Mental health, our sense of disconnection, isolation is still really a big issue with
Yeah.
all ages. And I think we're all, and you sort of spoke about this a little bit, we're all craving connection and meaning. So, one of the sort of magical things that we as designers have is this opportunity to create place. If we know we're going to be inside, if statistically we're inside 85 to 95% of our time, maybe you and I are out on bikes, but a lot of us are inside 85 to 90% of our time. Well, my goodness, we really have the opportunity to use that space to enrich us. And now we understand what's really amazing about our time now is there's a lot of data. And we understand at a cellular level what biophilia does. And that's one of my great comebacks to my kids because I can say, you guys, it's documented. It lowers your stress, it increases your, activity, it promotes so many things that are really good. Attention span, it lowers your blood pressure, all these amazing things. So,
That statistic of 85 to 95% of our time is spent inside. And then that was exacerbated by COVID.
yeah.
And so we're probably in, I would guess, in a time of maybe spending a little less time inside. And when we do spend so much time inside, I bet there's those patterns might be harder to break. I mean, is there any statistics about post COVID of spending more time outside, or what do we know about that?
I think people are more intentional in wanting to do that. One of our challenges, the positive and negative of our digital world, is that so much of what we do is connected to our digital world. And it depends on what environments you're in, whether you can really do that outside. So that becomes one of the challenges that we are dealing with at this
Ah,
point in time. So it becomes more intentional. But, one of the things that I think, if we think about, there's so much we can do with design and views and windows and wood and all these elements that I know we'll talk a little bit about, but there is great opportunity to, I think, really have that cellular level of connection to nature, even if we're not literally in the forest. There's a lot of tools.
this is so great. Let's riff on that a little bit. What trends are you seeing in design or architecture that feel like really positive responses to today's reality as you just described it?
Maybe I'll share a few projects with you. There's a elementary school that we designed on Bainbridge Island, which is here in Seattle, and it is a building that is built into a very steep site. And as you approach this elementary school, there's this colonnade of trees that hold up this overhang, and that those colonnade of trees move all the way into the inside and up the stairs. So there's this big wide stair. You walk in, there's these stairs, there's railings that are made out of wood. And it's this immersive environment. You look outside, you can see outside. And at the end of this campus, if you will, is a library. And the library has the carpet is inspired by the forest floor.
Uh,
And why that's important is it's about fractals. Fractals are a patterning that we see in nature that our brain, it's basically repeating patterns in natural elements that at different scales. So, an example of that is tree branches. If you look at tree branches, if you just observe them a little longer than you normally would, you'll see they break and then they break again and they break again.
yeah.
And that pattern is repeating, or a snowflake, if you were to look at that under
Yes.
us, right, under a microscope. So, this library, for instance, has this biophilic patterning on the floor. It has wood timbers that create this little alcove for reading. And what you see is when you go observe, we do post occupancy studies where we go observe to see how our spaces are working, what's not working.
Yeah.
And you see kids strewn all over the floor reading their books in the little alcove where a teacher might be sharing with them, and they're sort of laying down and they're sitting and they're in all different positions on that wood. And to me, that those are examples of biophilia really supporting the user. So, and engaging the user.
You love that. I mean, I want to go to elementary school now. And, I'll share a contrast,
Yeah.
which is my beloved hometown of Port Angeles, Washington, where I went to middle school and high school. And boy, this is a special community, just such lovely people, loving, lovely people. And I've been back a number of times for various events. And occasionally I'll drive up to my old high school, and it is a high school in need of massive, well, it should be just torn down and a new one built up because it's kind of brown and drab and gray. It literally looks the same as when I was there a long time ago. And I just
Yeah.
had this thought of like, it's just, even as you approach it, and I know this is not a community with lots of money, right? They haven't passed
Yeah.
the levies that are needed to do work to create a much better environment. And it's just really not a space that I think matches actually the spirit of the community. It was a little
Mhm.
depressing to me to go up and say, oh gosh, still it looks like
Mm.
that. So, I mean, spirit endures despite some of these spaces, of course, but what you're describing, and I love your example of fractals, of that this is a natural pattern that then you brought inside. It's one of these indirect examples of biophilia.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it to me that's one of the really exciting things that we have right now with our industry is now that we've realized all the amazing things that biophilia can do for us in nourishing us. Some of that is, when we think of our three buckets, some of it is internal creation of space that
Mm.
supports one, whether it's prospect and refuge, but some of it is that pattern. And, there's pattern that is created through fractals, which now can be woven into patterns on screens that we might create for dividing space. Fractals can be woven into ceiling planes. And I know we mentioned this, but why does that matter? Why are fractals important? But our brain um, observes and consumes fractals in a much more efficient way because we understand fractals from our many hundreds of years of being outside and being in the environment. And so it now just it's a very simplified way that our brain can process that. So that is why we calm, and when
Uh,
your blood pressure goes down and all those things, whether it's we're amongst fractals or we're amongst wood or we're amongst a daylight that's creating a pattern on the ground, those are things that can be really powerful tools, but fractals are one of them.
I love, well, anything that can help my brain be more efficient and when I
Yes.
want. So I
Yes.
think that's true for all of us. There's just so much
Yes.
noise in today's society, right? With
Yeah.
you turn on TV or stream on our gadgets and our computers, and it's on the one hand, we don't want to put our head in the sand and pretend that there isn't a lot of turmoil, that there isn't
Mhm.
a lot of
Mhm.
polarization, because that actually just, first of all, it can be a helpful coping mechanism when we do feel overwhelmed. So I want to validate
Yeah.
that. But at a larger level, being in a place of high agency and feeling that we can have some influence and control over our environment, even with the noise. Well, we need
Mhm.
more of that. And I guess what you're talking about is if we pay attention to biophilia
Yes.
principles in our daily life, that can be helpful for us to navigate these turbulent times.
Absolutely. One of the things that I think about when I think about biophilia is the more we all know, the more we'll be able to draw ourselves closer to spaces that have that. It's if you walk into a space and it feels good,
Yeah.
think about that, right? Think about what is it in this space. The other day I went to the Nordic Museum, which is a museum here in Seattle, and we designed it and it was super cool. And it's one of those places where it brings community together, but it also is very reflective space. So a very sort of when I've done some research on talking with people about sense of community and sense of belonging, what creates that, people will often talk about places and spaces that help encourage that, but they will also talk about their communal connection to nature, which I think is fascinating. And anyway, the Nordic Museum to me has this ability to do both. It has the ability, when you walk into the Nordic Museum, it's this sliver of space that from the front to the back, it's about 5 stories high. It has an atrium glass above that drenches you in light. And then it has these two mass elements on each side that are part of the museum elements. But you walk in and you're just in awe. You're in awe of the volume. It's not one of those spaces that you feel overwhelmed in. It's one of those spaces that you are intrigued. And there's over a bridge as you move through the space a little farther down, and you look at the bridge and you think, how do I get up there? That would be so cool. Like
Mhm.
there are people up there, they're walking back, like, so there's this intrigue, right? And you look at the ground and there's patterns of light that has been created that will change over the day. So you feel nature in that space, but as an example, it's not full of plants. You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
it's about the outside is being felt in the inside.
I love how excited you are about that. And you just said it's about the outside being felt inside, which is that sense of nature, bringing it in. It strikes me also that where we can curate those spaces, it also helps us actually feel our insides,
Mm,
meaning who we are and where we find grounding internally, right? So that it's
yeah.
not dependent on that, but that spaces can help accentuate that sense of inner grounding, which is
Yes.
such a powerful antidote to the places and spaces, whether it's on social media or if you're in the community and or in your family, right?
Yeah.
Where that family member voted for that person and you just feel that anxiety. And I mean, those are the everyday things that most of us, and a lot of us, well, that's partly why I started the podcast, and people who listen care about regrounding at this time. And so I would love to get your view on one thing, which is you've described this amazing museum that's here in Seattle, and we have a lot of listeners from literally around the world. And so in the towns and cities and spaces that we live in, many people have access to go visit,
Hmm.
and there are a subset of us and listeners that are able to curate our own living spaces or have some influence in our workspaces. But it's also true that many people don't feel they have the resources or the know how to create the sense of biophilia that you've been describing. So, what advice would you offer? What can anyone do, regardless of their circumstances, to begin to integrate principles of biophilia?
For me, I think one of the first things that I would say is learn as much as you can, right? And one of the ways that I do that is when I'm in a space, whether it's a library, whether it's a community space, whether it's someone else's home, I think about how does this feel to me? And what are some of the elements of that space? So, when you're young in your career in design, and all throughout your career, you are always an observant, right? You are always evaluating. What is it about the lighting? What is about the form of this space? What is about the integral elements of art that it just feels like it's woven in, that's creating that sense of context and space? So I just encourage people to really be aware of your spaces and sort of educate yourself in that form. And then I also think, simple things. I think about daylight, and daylight
Mm,
is so important. And sometimes we can find, whether you're at your home, whether we all make choices every day that don't necessarily cost money per se, but if you're in your office, if you're choosing to go to a coffee shop, if you're at home, get connected to a window. And sometimes when we do a lot of evaluations, when we're doing renovations or when we're doing new construction, we go and experience a space. There are times where I look and I see people have all the shades down. And
yeah,
I understand some of it that is totally valid in that there's glare, but
yeah,
there's simple things. There are shades and window coverings that enable you to see out. At the same time, it filters the light.
yeah.
So if you have that opportunity, that's a little tiny thing you can do that still will
Daylight.
enable, right.
Yeah. And if for some reason you're in a apartment or a home that doesn't have a lot of natural light, you're saying seek it out somehow, whether
Yeah.
it's going to a coffee shop or even going outside. But the emphasis is on the importance of daylight. We are both based here in Seattle, and we're coming out of the big dark, as we call it, right? Where we
Yeah.
have shorter days and not a lot of sunlight here because of our climate. I do blue lights all around, which is not
Yeah.
daylight, but there is
Yep.
some research that suggests accentuating light through blue lights if you're in a low light setting can actually help. So does that count as well?
That
Okay.
absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And then it's just observing how you feel. And often, we all, after you go for a walk, there's a certain feeling out in the woods. There's a certain feeling you
Yeah.
have. And being aware of what that is. And then when you experience something like that in a space, be aware of what that is. The other thing I think about is when you said, what can people do? Natural materials.
Okay.
When we make choices, whether it's for our home and we're going to get a table, and it doesn't have to be expensive, but if there's something you can do, if it can be a wood table, and it can be from a scrapyard, it can be from a used materials place. It doesn't have to be expensive, but wood has a feeling when you touch it. Wood has a pattern that our body appreciates. It has a smell at times. So that's an example. Or you could choose, when you're doing furniture, wool, for instance, is a great option for many reasons, but it's a natural material. When we
Yeah.
choose clothes, if we're able to choose what, linen or natural materials that our body appreciates, those are all things that
Uh,
connect us in a subtle way.
that is so huge. I mean, so much of our clothing has plastic in it. And you're inviting us to seek out natural woven fibers. And one of the things that I do pay a lot of attention to my space, and I've you traveled a good bit in my various roles, including to sub-Saharan Africa, and I have a small collection of woven baskets. Most of which were not expensive, and a number were actually given to me by people I met, and I'm so drawn to woven baskets. One, because it tells, for me, having been in these spaces, reminds me of the space and the culture that I learned about and the people. And so there's a connection, emotional connection, but it's natural fabric, right? So I think that's wood or woven fabrics. And I want to highlight that it doesn't have to be expensive. You're just saying make time to try to find these things. Any other tips for those of us who want to pay more attention to this?
Yeah, yeah. You just spoke about something that I think is really important, and it's contextual. What makes something contextual
Mm,
as well as intentional? And those are layers within biophilia in that local to you, connected to you. So as we're creating our spaces, whether it's at work or at home, having elements like that are so meaningful is really powerful. It connects us to that time, but also the elements you're talking about are in fact naturally woven and of the earth and that sort of thing. So I think that's really amazing. I haven't talked a lot about plants and flowers and that sort of thing because that is what people, if people do know a little bit about biophilia, that's something that they automatically think about. And
yeah.
those those are wonderful elements to have in our spaces for many reasons, but that's just not the only thing. But those are additional things that can really change our well-being.
These are really, really, really great tips for all of us to think about. And when you think about the work that you're doing, is there anything that's changed in how you approach your work now that might be different than a year ago due to kind of the meta environment that we're in? I mean, your work has, you've been called to create spaces, right, where biophilia principles flourish and thrive. So I know that's a constant for you, but has anything shifted? And you're a partner in this amazing big firm. Are you all having any different conversations these days, or is it because the principles are so consistent, nothing's really changing?
Well, it's interesting. What's kind of cool about it is I think it's becoming more understood. Biophilia was first coined in the early 1900s. So it has been a word and a concept for quite a while. But we now are beginning to have data on it and the power of it. We now are beginning to have more tools that we can use in our design process that can really facilitate that. So things like mass timber, it's new to the United States a bit in the last, handful of years. Europe has been utilizing it more longer period of time, but it's basically innovative wood structural system that can create buildings. And why that's important is it used to have a smaller, we used to only be able to do, I think it was 5 floors, and now we can do up till 18 floors, which is it's a real big, it really adds a whole lot of additional project types that we can
Yeah.
incorporate with that. But why that's important and that's really beneficial to us as humans is that mass timber as one tool, one element, you walk into a building of mass timber, it smells like
Oh,
wood.
wow, back to our initial conversation of smell, a full sensory experience.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely.
Wow.
And you can touch it and feel it, and that's one thing. I think another one of the sort of trends we're seeing is some of the building certification programs are now including this idea of biophilia as a tool for measurement.
Oh, wow.
So that's wonderful.
I love hearing that, and I will say, I want to give a shout out to a friend of mine, David Rosowski, works at Arizona State University. He's a senior advisor, and he and I do some fun work together, and he's an engineer. And I asked him about his work early before he got into academia, and he said, I did mass timber. He was one of these early guys who actually started thinking about how could you scale big buildings from a structural engineering perspective. So I might have to connect you with him. He's
Love that.
super, super thoughtful. Yeah, neat
Yeah,
person. So I love that trend.
yeah.
I love bringing timber in, and I And so Europe's a little more advanced than us on that. Why is that the case? I mean, I'm not surprised, but
Yeah, right. They tend to jump into things a little bit sooner than we have. We tend to have a lot more codes and a lot more testing that we
Mm,
require. And some of that's good. An example I think is a really interesting example is when 9/11 collapsed, the structural system collapsed. It was because the structural system melted, and one of
mm,
the things that we had to test as an industry with mass timber is the burning point. And so what we found is that it chars but doesn't collapse near as fast as all these other structural systems that we've been using for a long time. So we tend to have a lot more, testing that we have to do here in the United States. But anyway, that's kind of a cool outcome that we've been able to now utilize, and to your friend's example, be able to,
ah,
I'm so excited that he was a pioneer. To me, it's one of the
yeah.
coolest things.
Part of my work in my last role at a great organization called Nia Taro, I had the honor of getting to know a number of different indigenous identified colleagues. And this notion of fire management, of course, if you live in these beautiful giant forests, whether they're boreal forests or tropical forests, you know a thing or two about fire management because you've kind of been on the land for thousands of years. And one of the things is that density of maintaining that old growth, a density of it actually inhibits fire from spreading. So it's a principle of not all, there's vast diversity, vastly different indigenous peoples and cultures, but from some of the learnings I've had, they have already had an understanding of that, which is why, clean cutting the forests, we're thinking about clearing things so that fires don't spread. It actually, the opposite can be true. They're more resilient against fires. It's the newer growth that's less resilient. So there's a little bit of a tie there. I mean, does that make sense from your perspective and the work you're doing?
Absolutely. And I think you've said a couple things that are really intriguing to me, talking about really honoring some of what our Indigenous communities have brought forward for us, knowledge like that, as well as some of the art, as well as so many things and ways of thinking.
It reminds me of a visit I had to a friend recently who has a really small space, and he wouldn't have the financial means to buy like a big house and get an interior designer or have you come in and work with them. And in his space, I walked in and I just felt so calm, right? Because it wasn't the size of the space. He actually didn't have a lot of natural light either. And I tend to be really sensitive when homes are really dark, and he just brought in so much from his family culture in terms of images of his family. The art that he had was like from his friends. And there was a simplicity of the space. And it makes me think of this contextual relationship that he has to his family and his cultures that he's a part of. And that showed up in his space. And for me, it was a very loving, even like I would say, spiritual space, that calming. And so it doesn't have to be big spaces. And that's such a beautiful expression of cultural sovereignty and expression, but that rootedness of who we are and bringing out our full selves in our space. I think that seems to be very related to biophilia.
Absolutely. Yeah. When you talked about how do spaces help people feel grounded, what makes
Mhm.
spaces help people feel grounded, to your point, we don't have to have every single element of biophilia. Having several of those elements can just be create spiritual spaces like you just mentioned. And there's something else that you mentioned that I think is really interesting that I've learned over the last few years. And what there's a book and it's called Third Place. And one of the things that, and Third Teacher, but one of the things that it talks about is when we, education spaces actually, when you go into a kindergarten classroom, the classroom sometimes every single inch of the wall is full.
Yeah.
And our brains, they're telling us that our brains can get overwhelmed, some people. And if there is the ability to simplify for our
Mm,
brains, and when you said simplify, the space was simple, it had a
yeah.
simplicity to it. When we think about what we can do, think about that. And I often think about that when I'm designing space
Yeah.
and someone says, I don't know, should we do this or this? I always take a step back and say, let's just keep it simple.
Wow.
Let's
It's a good life
allow,
philosophy. Yeah.
yeah, allow the beautiful things. There might be a few beautiful elements. Let those breathe and speak, you know.
Ooh, breathe and speak. How about that?
Yeah,
Like more spaces like that. I really am so inspired by this. And, one of the big themes of the podcast this year, and this gets us to kind of our last question,
yeah,
is about creating a sense of agency at a time of a lot of change, a time of, for many people, a lot of uncertainty. There's so much noise. There's lots of polarization, right? And then the other side of that is that there's so much love and kindness. We have an abundance, an unlimited abundance of love and kindness. I'm feeling this. It's starting to come through the cracks of the noise, right? Like those blades of grass that you see in concrete, like that's happening. And agency feels really core to that. And so, as you think about choices we can all make to bring in principles of biophilia to our lives, whether it's our home, our workspace, what would you wish for listeners? And again, this is Elizabeth's magic wand, right? What would you be your one wish for listeners to take away, or a wish for folks to be able to feel a sense of agency around our spaces?
yeah, yeah. I love that. I love your podcast, by the way. I love
Thanks.
the concept of what why you started it. Fun question. I think what I would say is we all actually can, in fact, impact our spaces and impact our choices. So, what I mean by that is we can choose, and this has nothing to do with expense. We can choose where we go to read our book. It could be at the library, it could be in the corner of our house next to the window, it could be in a forest. We have those choices. And sometimes, to your point, I think sometimes we get mired in heaviness, and to just kind of have that sense of breathing and thinking about what are our choices. And we have choices of when we are going to make design choices, whether it's something for our home or whether it's something for us as, apparel, whether it's where we, choose to stay overnight somewhere, we have choices, right? And so utilizing our choices with that in mind, I think can be really, really give us a sense of agency. So, and I also just want to put a plug in just to learning more about this topic. I think can nourish us all because the more we know, we all are in fact at some point going to be able to make choices, whether small or whether you're sitting on a design committee somewhere. Like it doesn't matter which scale you're at, we all are going to be able to contribute to this. And the more we know, the more I think we can all be nourished.
Well, I feel nourished by our conversation today. Thank you so much. And I have certainly learned more today. And I treasure our previous conversations. And I'll make
Yeah.
sure so that listeners, I'll put some links to places, online resources to learn more about biophilia. And just want to finish by lifting up your last comments that we all have, regardless of circumstance, choice and choicefulness about simple
Yeah.
things, about being attentive to our environments at a time when we need that more than ever, right? We need that more than ever. And so, nourishing ourselves, I think, nourishes the world. And that's a powerful, assertive thing to do for ourselves and our communities.
Yeah.
So, Elizabeth, thank you for spending time today. It's been so much fun.
Thank you so much. What a treat.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Space in Between podcast. If you did, please hit the like button and leave a review wherever you listen to the show. And check out the spaceinbetween.com website, where you can also leave me a message. Take good care.